monies or people ineligible, draining those programs, we got a lot of work to do. We won't be intimidated by the rhetoric. We won't be scared into paralysis anymore as a Republican Party. We're standing up with our president and fearless leader, Mr. Donald J. Trump, and we know the American people are behind us 100%. We're leaning in, and we're going to save this country, and we're going to give our children a fighting chance at the blessings of liberty and the land of opportunity. With that, I yield 2 minutes to my good friend, who is a fighter for our freedom and fiscal sanity. He's on the Budget Committee from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in full support of the House budget resolution. And Jody, I just want to thank you for the yeoman's work that you've done. You've stood tall and you stood strong. You know, for those who are watching on TV and for those of you who are listening, you know, we got in a steady diet of the same old worn out tactics, rich, poor, divinity politics, taking food from hungry children. You hadn't used Granny is going over the cliff yet, but I assume that's coming. You know, my question to my good friends on the other side, where were you the last 4 years? Where were you? We got a steady diet of high inflation. We got a steady diet of 15 million illegals coming across this country, using every public school, every hospital, not being a citizen, draining the payroll and draining the economy of America. What about the empathy for the poor unaccompanied children who came over here and are in sex trades, and if they're still living, many of them, well over 400,000 children. What about the inflation at every level? Where were you the last 4 years? House prices, where were you? Interest rates, you were nowhere to be found. Where were your solutions? You didn't have any, because we've got a total two world views. You think taxes paid by Americans is your money to spend like you want. Elon Musk and what Donald Trump are doing are identifying the waste. Let the American people judge. 77 million Americans judged on who they thought could lead this country. And it wasn't an inept president who couldn't give a press conference if he had to or read a thank you card. That's who you put up with for 4 years. And folks, the past is the judge of the future. This bill, I would love to have $5 trillion in cuts, but we got.
I yield the gentleman another 30 seconds.
We've got more to go. This is the first step. The journey starts with the first step. We're going to fight, and we're going to stop the policies that have bankrupted this country that y'all have indicated, that y'all have put up with for the last 4 years. Time's up. It's time for a new day. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields. Members are reminded to direct their comments to the chair. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Well, Mr. Chair, I would remind the gentleman that this bill would put 1 million people in South Carolina at risk of losing Medicaid. But I appreciate the previous speaker's candor, his saying that he wants $5 trillion worth of cuts. And to quote him, this is only the beginning. So I hope that every middle-class American hears that and knows what is coming, that by his own words, this is just the beginning. This is bad enough. What are we talking about? $880 billion worth of cuts to Medicaid and the ACA, $230 billion worth of cuts to nutrition programs, $330 billion of cuts to student loan programs, Pell Grants, Head Start, school lunches, and more and more. And why? Also tax cuts worth $4.5 trillion can go to the richest 1% of Americans. With that, Mr. Speaker, I am happy to yield 2 minutes to a wonderful new member of this body, the gentlewoman from New Jersey, a distinguished member of the Transportation Committee, Ms. Poe.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise for the first speech on the floor of this body to reject the Republican so-called budget. I came to Congress to help my constituents. I came here to provide direct relief to struggling Americans and lift people up. This Republican budget does none of those things. It is nothing more than a blueprint for cruelty. This GOP budget will destroy Medicaid and take health care away from millions of Americans. In my district alone, this could strip health care from the 215,000 people on Medicaid, blow up hospital budgets, raise insurance premiums, and all to give trillions in tax cuts to the millionaires. Another cash giveaway to the super rich at the expense of ruining American lives. I reject and I intend to vote no to this cruel Republican budget and yield back. Thank you.
From Pennsylvania Reserves, gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, my good friend and ranking member made a comment about Mr. Ralph Norman from South Carolina. He said, listen closely to what he said. He'd like to cut $5 trillion from the budget. Well, you know what? Add my name to that list, because the GAO says there's $5 trillion of fraud throughout the four corners of this federal government. That's the people's money. And we ought to spend every waking hour together across the aisle, bipartisan, to go and root out that waste and fraud that is fleecing the taxpayers. So you can count me in the camp of Mr. Ralph Norman. When the Government Accountability Office says that there are $5 trillion of defrauding the people's government and the people's money. You're not going to hear anybody on the other side of the aisle, and there's some good people and well-intended people. But in this debate, you're not going to hear them talk about illegals being on welfare rolls, or the fact that their President Joe Biden, with the stroke of a pen, welcomed illegals on to welfare and health care rolls. We can't even afford Social Security benefits that will, the fund of which will be insolvent within the next 10 years. And instead, we're bringing people that aren't even citizens onto the social safety nets that are paid for by taxpayers. And we're not spending that money, that precious treasure of taxpayers, to shore up Medicare and Social Security. It makes no sense to me, but you know what? It made no sense to the American people, and that's why they gave this president a mandate and gave this country unified Republican leadership. Now, they are still in denial, apparently, and they're definitely disconnected from the reality of the last 4 years. They may have had all the best intentions, but the pain and the suffering that the American people endured because of the reckless record trillions of dollars in spending and the failed economic policies of the last administration is real. They didn't forget it, and they voted with that acid test, that fundamental question: is my life better today? There's never been, I don't think, in American history, a clearer contrast between the two parties, back to back. Republican total control in 17 and 18, Democrat unified leadership on the heels of that, the philosophies, the values, the worldviews, the policies, and the consequences borne by the American people. And they have chosen a very different path, and they have asked us to reverse course and to reverse the curse that looms not only over this country, but our children's future. And I am surprised that I haven't heard one sentence about the waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government at $5 trillion. I'm surprised that I haven't heard any criticisms of the millions of people who've come to this country illegally and drained Medicaid, according to CBO, by billions of dollars. That was a letter in response to an inquiry that we sent. How much of the tax dollars in Medicaid are being siphoned off for people who are here illegally? I can't believe that there's not more indignation on account of the fact that $9,000 is what we're spending on people who broke the law, violated our sovereignty, and are here in this country illegally. And taxpayers are spending $9,000 per illegal immigrant for social services that were intended for the United States citizens. And that $9,000 represents more money than we spend on our own vulnerable American citizens on Medicaid. But you're not going to hear any of that today. But the American people know better. They've always had the better judgment, and they made the right call, and we aim to deliver for them. I don't know if my colleagues, how much time do I have, Mr. Chairman, remaining?
Minutes remaining.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
May I inquire as to how much time I have remaining?
Gentleman has 4¼ minutes remaining.
I am prepared to close.
Gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself the balance of my time. First, let me say before my closing, my good friend and chair of the Budget Committee, and we've worked closely together in opposition a lot of the time, but actually in agreement some of the time with some real achievements, though not today. He said something that really interests me, that there's this GAO report showing $5 trillion of fraud. Well, I certainly would be interested in seeing that report. The size of the entire budget every year is only $6.5 trillion. So how in the world $5 trillion out of $6.5 trillion is really fraud? I find that a little hard to believe. Now, Mr. Chairman, we're at a pivotal moment. I said at the beginning of this debate some 2.5 hours ago that this budget resolution represents the Republican betrayal of the middle class. For the last 2.5 hours, you have heard speaker after speaker on my side expose exactly why that is so. First and foremost, and I think most crucially, the $880 billion in cuts to Medicaid, the largest cuts in American history to Medicaid. Why is that important? 72 million Americans rely on Medicaid. Another 20 million rely and get their health care through the Affordable Care Act. They are also at risk. We have heard further that while those are the biggest cuts, there are even more, hundreds of billions of dollars in cuts to nutrition assistance, school lunch programs, Pell Grants, Head Starts, and the list goes on and on. And why? All to deliver $4.5 trillion of tax cuts to the richest 1% of Americans. And let's not forget the fact that in order to cover the rest of the cost of those tax cuts, they are increasing the debt limit by $4 trillion. They like to talk about debt and how horrible it is, but this piece of legislation will make our debt situation far worse. This is the Republican betrayal of the middle class. Day after day, in my home state of Pennsylvania, you had candidates from both sides talking about how the number one priority should be to lower costs for Americans. The president made that promise. He said he would do it on day one. Well, here we are, more than a month in, not one executive order, not one bill to lower costs for the American people. Instead, we have this bill to take money from the middle class and give it to those who need it the least. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to lead the opposition to this Republican betrayal of the middle class. I urge every member of this House to vote no. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make my closing remarks consume as much time as we have on the clock here, but let me also pay respects to my ranking member. He is a great guy. He has been a really good partner. We've done some really important things together on a bipartisan basis. In fact, we've passed more bipartisan legislation to fix the broken budget process, which doesn't serve either party in this institution well. And I give him equal credit, if not more credit, because when you're in the minority, there's tremendous pressure not to work with the majority. But he's an American first, and we may disagree, but I know where his heart is. Now, let me answer the question of the ranking member. The $5 trillion is a CBO score. That's a 10-year budget window score, just like the $2 trillion that we have as a goal to reduce reckless, wasteful, and fraudulent spending. Now, Mr. Chairman, the reconciliation process is generally to reconcile the House and Senate budgets, but more than a process for matching up revenues and outlays, this exercise, more importantly, is reconciling the difference between the American people's interest, expectations, and values, and a federal government that has totally lost its way, forgotten who it serves, and too often has failed to faithfully and fairly and efficiently execute the laws of the land. And if we learned anything from the November election, it's that the American people want a strong country. They want a competent leader, common sense policies, and they want all of us to put America first. And that's what this budget resolution does. I'd like to think of this budget resolution as a promissory note to our children to preserve the land of liberty and opportunity by safeguarding it from an unwieldy government and with unbridled spending, taxing, and regulating that threatens to destroy it. Mr. Chairman, I said this in the Budget Committee, and I'm going to say it now to close. The era of wasteful, woke, and weaponized government is over, and this budget resolution will be its tombstone. Here lies one of the darkest chapters in American history: open borders, record crime, lawlessness, feckless foreign policies, cost of living crises. Enough. It's time to reverse the curse. It's time to reverse the reckless spending, the failed policies, do the first and most important job of the federal government, keep the American people safe. That's exactly what we intend to do, and that's exactly what we've delivered with this framework. So, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on House Concurrent Resolution 14, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman, Mr. Schweikert, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Beyer, each will control 30 minutes on the subject of economic goals and policies. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
And Mr. Chairman, and to the minority, I first want to apologize to everyone. I have one of my crappy lung infections, so at some point I'm going to start coughing and doing an inhaler. Just ignore me. Somehow I thought that'd be funnier. Mr. Chairman, and to my good friend, Mr. Beyer, this, I think, is somewhat of a unique opportunity for those of us from the Joint Economic Committee. We actually take math seriously. We don't always see things alike, but the fact of the matter is the Joint Economic Committee, I think started in 1956, has this remarkable history of some of the world's greatest economists coming and speaking before it and walking us through it. And that's why this moment we're going to try to do something that's special. Instead of just sort of sharing feelings, I'm going to ask us to share math. And within that, we're going to walk through what's actually in the budget resolution. This is a reconciliation budget. It's not a regular budget. This is a budget that opens up the ability, because the insanity we go through of moving something through the Senate and it's 60 votes. So the 1974 Budget Control Act, this is the dance we go through. The other thing I'm going to try to walk through is where the actual math lays in the box that's been given to us by the Budget Committee. And then the part I'm going to do, the Schweikert little bit of hope, is this the moment? Is this the moment of policy that actually forces us, both the left and the right, that if there's cuts, modernization, changes, updates in methodology, how we deliver services, is this the stressor that makes us do something that's hard, but also do something that's truthful? I'm also going to try repeatedly to make the point, Mr. Chairman, and show why are we primarily doing this? We have a handful, actually a bunch of provisions of the 2017 tax reform that begin to expire. Most of those provisions actually are the benefit of small businesses and the working class. And I will show that over and over, and the distributional effects. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to this budget resolution, and I yield such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this budget is disastrous for the American economy. It will balloon our deficits, it will lead to higher interest rates, and will make the things Americans buy every day more expensive. It will slash critical investments in the things that make us healthier, safer, and more productive. Things like cancer research, aviation security, and our national park system. And it will decimate critical programs that support the people we represent, stripping healthcare from millions and make it harder for families to put food on the table and make ends meet. All of this for billionaires and corporations that get tax cuts they do not need and that our country cannot afford. I'm pleased to do this with my friend, Chairman Schweikert. I also believe in math, and I rarely brag, but I'm good at math. Americans have been clear. They want lower prices and an economy that works for them. Yet instead of focusing on making life easier for American families, at every turn, this administration and our Republican colleagues have engaged in a scorched earth policy. A policy that creates chaos across the country as the richest person on the planet eliminates services that our nation depends upon. My friend from South Carolina earlier said the policies would bankrupt our country. What's he mean? Health care for our families, food for the working poor who overwhelmingly live in Republican districts? Sure, get rid of any identified bloat, as every president does. But this is a budget about billionaires, not about the every American women, men, and children we represent. Yes, I want to move towards a much smaller budget deficit. I listen to David Schweikert every closing afternoon during his special order hours. I hate the higher interest costs.
Huge.
All right, and that's a very big one that Howard just read, but they're both big. They're all big. We're only doing big ones. Okay?
executives of the wealthiest corporations at a time when corporate profits are at an all-time high. Americans who rely on government services will be told they need to make sacrifices to pad those profit margins even further. How does that make any sense? To pay for these tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy, the Republican budget proposes to cut programs Americans rely on to afford health care and to put food on the table. Almost 100 million Americans, including seniors, children, families, and those from every corner of this country, depend on Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act to afford medical care. Yet this budget would slash almost $900 billion from these critical programs, ripping away life-saving coverage and raising health care costs for those who rely on them. And at a time when prices at the grocery stores continue to climb, this budget would make it even harder for the 40 million Americans who rely on SNAP to put food on the table. The budget we are considering today will nothing to support the economic growth of this nation. It will benefit the wealthiest at the expense of those who make this country work. I urge my colleagues to reject it. With that, I reserve, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. All right, I've got to figure out, do I sit here and just spend my time correcting things that are mathematically not true or not in the design of what's actually here? Or just over and over say how much I like working with Mr. Beyer as because one day you'll be the chair and I'll be in your position. So let's actually walk through some basic math together. What will our spending be this year? It will be $7 trillion. What is actually in the cuts?
The ones that sue, not them. And they use it almost as a form of running European countries, and the EU in particular has been very violent in its lawsuits against our companies, and frankly, very violent and very bad to our airlines. I've gotten calls from the heads of airlines saying they stop in Europe and they're getting charged all sorts of taxes that they never even heard of. They stop and they're getting fined and charged, and they do it only with American companies. They're not doing it to other countries, so we're stopping it. And we have another thing, we have another step to go, and if they don't shape up, as an example, Apple has had to pay like $17 billion in a lawsuit that nobody thought was worth anything. And I won't get into the judge or the decision or how the decision was arrived, but I'm pretty good at this stuff, and I think it's disgraceful. And Google's being sued. Facebook's being sued, and many others are being sued by their so-called government, if you call it a government, EU, and they don't treat us right. They don't treat us right as a country. So we're going to protect our companies. We have to protect our companies. So we're not going to have any companies left anymore. I also want to thank Apple, though, for announcing they're going to invest $500 billion in our country. That's the biggest investment anybody's probably made to this date. And they're going to do it very quickly, and that's because of tariffs. They don't want to pay the tariffs, and they feel very strongly about the country. Now, they wouldn't have done it without us. Without the Trump administration, they wouldn't have done it. But they feel very strongly about the direction of the country. The polls have shown that, too. The polls are coming out showing direction of the company is of the country is the best they've ever seen, actually. Best they've ever seen. So I just want to thank Tim Cook and Apple for the confidence. $500 billion. That's the biggest investment anyone has made in a short period of time.
Mr. President, have you spoken today with the House Republican holdouts who
Yeah.
said they would not be supporting the budget resolution?
Well, I'm not involved in that. They know what I want, and the Senate knows what I want too. And the Senate's got a bill that's very strong, having to do with the taxes, because the taxes is what's bringing all these companies in. So. And without it, by the way, you'd have to double your own taxes. Everybody would be doubled up, and you'd have the biggest tax increase ever. So the House has a bill and the Senate has a bill, and I'm looking at them both, and I'll make decisions. But I don't know where they are in the vote. I know the Senate's doing very well, and the House is doing very well. But each one of them has things that I like. So we'll see if we can come together.
Mr. President, can you clarify, hopefully once and for all, what your expectations are with this email to federal employees? What are you going to use that information for? And do you see it as voluntary, like OPM has said, or mandatory?
Yeah, well, it's somewhat voluntary, but it's also if you don't answer, I guess you get fired. What it really
I'm
is,
still lost on that.
what it is do people exist? We have this massive government with millions of people, and nobody knows who's working for the government, who's not. So what they're doing is they're sending out a letter to everybody, and they're saying, what were the things you did last week? I guess they ask for 5. And if people are working, it's easy. I could tell you 5 things I did last week. I could tell you 5 things I did 6 weeks ago, right? If they're there and they're working, they're able to say they did 5 things during work. And that means they're working and they're with us and they have no further obligation. If they're not, it could be there's no such person. It could be that the person's no longer working. They're no longer living at that address. They may be moved. Maybe they moved to a different country, or maybe the person doesn't exist. And we then take that person off the payroll, and we save a lot of money by doing that. But that's one of the only ways. I think it's a very smart thing. And it says, if you don't answer, essentially, there's a penalty to pay. Like, that's the end of the job.
Musk has said that. The order itself doesn't say that. I think that's part of the confusion. Is he speaking for you when he says you'll be terminated?
Yeah, everybody speaks for me. I'm the one. I'll take responsibility. The old statement, the buck stops here, right? Famous statement. Well, I can say the same thing. The buck stops here. No, we have to find out if people are getting paid and they're not working. And, they have a problem. Let's say they have another job and then they write in false statements. It's a big problem if they write in false statements. They may be working for somebody else, but getting paid by the U.S. government. And that would mean that they're not allowed to be doing that. They're not allowed to be working for us and be working for somebody else. We're paying them a lot of money. We're paying them. So we'll see. That solves that problem. Most people aren't willing to say that, we're doing this, and this, and this for the U.S. government, and yet they're at another job, because that's a big problem for them if they do that. So in some cases, they're not writing back. And if they don't write back, they end up eventually losing their job. We give them extensions, but that was something we thought about a long time ago. We give them extensions, but we'll see. We have to make sure, number one, that we have people, number two, that they're working, and number two, they're working for us, not for another company.
Is it true that President Zelensky is coming on Friday to meet with you, and is the mineral deal sorted out?
Yeah, I hear that. I hear that he's coming on Friday. Certainly, it's okay with me if he'd like to, and he would like to sign it together with me, and I understand that's a big deal, very big deal. And I think the American people, even if you look at polling, they're very happy because, Biden was throwing money around like it's cotton candy. And it's a very big deal. Look, it could be $1 trillion deal. It could be whatever, but it's rare earths and other things. And look, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on Ukraine and Russia fighting. A war that should have never, ever happened. That's a war that would have never happened if I were president. And it didn't happen for 4 years. People say, how do we know that? It didn't happen for 4 years. Would have never happened. And nevertheless, this guy went into this situation and he spent money like nobody's ever seen, $350 billion. The other thing that we don't like is that Europe has spent $100 billion. We've spent $350 billion. Europe gets their money back because they spent it in the form of a loan. And we just gave them, whether it's 300 or 350 billion, nobody really knows. They can't even tell me the answer to that, but it means probably more than that. So what we're doing is now we're saying, look, we want to be secured. We want to get that money back. We're helping a country through a very, very big problem, a problem like very few people have had. Shouldn't have had this problem because it shouldn't have happened, but it did happen. So we have to straighten it out. But the American taxpayer now is going to get their money back plus.
Mr. President, yesterday with Emmanuel Macron, you said you had spoken to Putin about the idea of peacekeepers in Ukraine, that Putin was fine with it. The Kremlin, I guess, has said that that's actually unacceptable to them. What's real here?
That's not what I was told, but you're going to need some form of peacekeeping. So something will be done that's going to be satisfactory to everybody. We need peacekeeping too.
Any situation
It's
where
actually,
American troops involved?
it's actually something I did discuss, but a form of peacekeeping that's acceptable to everybody. Ultimately, we'll be able to agree on something, I'm sure.
With Ukraine and this mineral deal, what does Ukraine get in return, Mr. President?
$350 billion and lots of equipment, and military equipment, and the right to fight on, and originally the right to fight. Look, Ukraine, I will say they're very brave and they're good soldiers, But without the United States and its money and its military equipment, this war would have been over in a very short period of time. In fact, I was the one that gave the javelins. You remember the famous javelins? That was me. That wasn't Obama. It wasn't Biden. It wasn't anybody else. It was me. And they wiped out a lot of tanks with those javelins. And the expression was that Obama gave sheets and I gave the javelins. That was a big deal at the time. It wiped out. That was the beginning when people said, wow, that's something. Well, that was American equipment. Without American equipment, this war would have been over very quickly. And American money, too. I mean, a lot of money.
So
Mr. President.
That war fighting equipment and the ammunition, that's sustained going forward for Ukraine, and how long is it sustained?
Well, it could go forward for a while, and maybe until we have a deal with Russia. Look, we need to have a deal with Russia, otherwise it's going to continue. But now, when Americans put up their money, the taxpayer money, and the president approves it, we're getting our money back in some form. But it could go on for a while, or it could be settled quickly. I think it's going to be settled quickly. I spoke with President Putin. I think he wants to settle it, and wants to get on with life. It's horrible. What's happening, horrible. Thousands of soldiers a week are being killed, and others too, but especially on the battlefield. Thousands a week are being killed, and we want that to end.
Mr. President, when you spoke
Brian?
Yes, okay. Real quickly, Carolyn Levitt, your press secretary, sent an earthquake through that briefing room earlier today announcing that the WHCA would not have any control over placing media in the seats, the briefing room. Just want to get your thoughts on that. And also on Air Force One, it's trending on X. People are talking about it. Get your thoughts.
Well, we're going to be now calling those shots. As you know, we won that lawsuit right there. See, the Gulf of America, which is a beautiful name. Most people agree. I don't know. It's, AP has been terrible. Look, I think they're radical left. I think they're third-rate reporters. I know the specific young lady that works on the account is terrible. She's a radical left lunatic, as far as I'm concerned. They don't treat us fairly. That's number one. And number two, they had no right to do that. This is the Gulf of America. And if you look at that shoreline, look at that shoreline. Look, from Florida, well, most of it is, it's called America. And vast majority, like big numbers. So I'm just admiring it as I look at it. I'm getting teary-eyed, but I don't want you to say Trump broke down and started crying. No, how beautiful is that? Look at the shoreline. Look at that. That's America.
Can I shift our attention to Canada real quick?
Yes, please.
Last week, I spent some time with two government officials for Canada. I was asking them how realistic is it that Canada would be the 51st state?
Yeah.
And they told me there is a path. Alberta is first, and if they sign on, Saskatchewan would follow, and then you go west to British Columbia. There is a movement in Canada to join us. I want to get your thoughts on that and how that's proceeding.
So it's true. Thank you, Brian. It's true. A lot of people in Canada are liking becoming our beautiful, cherished 51st state. They'll have to pay much lower taxes. They'll have the ultimate security. You know, they don't pay very much for security right now because they rely on us, which is really unfair to us. They make cars that we could make, and they send them back into the United States. They make a lot of things, including the sending of oil and everything. We don't need their oil. We don't need their lumber. In fact, we're going to be freeing up, and I've asked Howard Lutnick to get that done with Lee and everybody, Lee Zeldin, environmental. We're freeing up our forests. We're going to be able to take down trees. Right now, you know, we're so restricted environmentally. We're going to be freeing it up with an emergency order. We have an emergency order, and we're going to be freeing up our forests. We have more forests than almost anybody, and great lumber, great trees. We don't need anybody's trees. We don't need trees from Canada or anybody else. In fact, we have to put the slits, as they call them, the area, 50, 60-yard area in between areas of trees. It stops the fires. And frankly, California should have been doing that for years. It's almost getting late. They're going to run out of forests the way they're going. What a shame. And by the way, the water is flowing in California. I hope you people have seen it, but the water is flowing. Do you have a picture of that? I'd hold it up. Do you have a picture of that? Get a picture of it, please. You know, we had a little skirmish in California. I can't believe we had to do that, but we opened up the water in California. The water was flowing into a place called the Pacific Ocean, which for the Pacific Ocean is only a drop. But for us, it's more water than we can use in California. So I'll get you some photographs, but it's a beautiful sight. The water is flowing in California, beautiful water from the Pacific Northwest and beyond. And it flows down, and instead of being routed out to the Pacific Ocean, and this has been going on for 20 years more in order to take care of a certain species of fish, which wasn't doing very well without water, I can tell you. So that's a big deal. It's like not reported. It's incredible. But California has a lot of water. That's going to take care of farmers. It's going to wetten up the land. And it's going to go all the way down to Los Angeles, where they have curfews on water, where they have all sorts of blocks on water. You can only use so much. We're going to put until just recently, they were going to put a number of gallons per person living in a house in Beverly Hills on water. You're not going to have that problem anymore. Do you have a picture? Let me just see what that looks like. How beautiful is that? Look at that beautiful water flowing. Look at that. That's coming in the dikes and other means of transportation. Isn't that beautiful? Who would believe that? That's all water they could have had. I went to the governor during my first term and I said, why don't you do this? And they said they have an environmental problem with clean water. If this water were there, you wouldn't have had those fires. You had sprinklers. They make people put sprinklers in the ceiling of a home and they had no water in them. With this, they would have had a lot of water in them. They would have all been full. That would have had you would have had a whole different deal down there. You probably wouldn't have had a fire, but if it was, it would have been small, would have been put out. You had the fire hydrants not working in California. So it's a beautiful site. These are canals that were built. These were all built. And you saw them for years. They were empty, concrete. They call them the V-shapes or the half pipes. And they're shaped different forms, but they're shaped. And they rush down through the farm areas where the farmers can take it and down to Los Angeles. And they were sitting empty for years. And now look at that. Look at that way it looked. It wasn't easy. We had to be very unfriendly to get into those areas. We opened it up.
Mr. President.
I essentially attacked California. Can you believe it? I attacked California. Let's go.
At the outset of your administration, sir, you committed to ending the weaponization of government, to holding those accountable who participated in the weaponization of government.
Hold it. This is a good one. Is everybody listening? Deranged Jack Smith. We're going to call it the Deranged Jack Smith signing or bill. Go ahead.
One law firm that provided pro bono legal services to the special counsel's office under Jack Smith's leadership was Covington and Burling. As a result of those actions, we're now going to be suspending and putting under review the security clearances for the attorneys and employees at that firm who worked with Jack Smith's team. And we're going to continue holding the people who were responsible for the weaponization of government and who supported it accountable for what they did.
And you'll be doing this with other firms as time goes by, right?
We're looking at sort of the whole panoply of options.
The weaponization of our system by law firms, even pro bono work they're doing just in order to clog up government, stop government. And nobody knows about it more than me. And hopefully that'll never happen again.
So the Covington and Burlington?
Covington and Burlington.
Mr. President, may I ask you a question about Europe? So long term, do you plan to maintain the number of U.S. troops?
Wait, I just want to savor this one, please. Who would like this pen? Hey, why don't you send it to Jack Smith? A deranged person.
What do you say to people who worry that targeting an individual firm or individuals who aren't Jack Smith for his actions?
I've been targeted for 4 years, longer than that. So you don't tell me about targeting. I was the target of corrupt politicians for 4 years, and then 4 years after that. So don't talk to me about targeting. Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. President, there are approximately 2 million federal employees right now. By the end of your term, What do you expect that number to be? What would you like that number to be?
Well, it'll be lower, but I can't tell you. Everybody knows I ran on downsizing government, but making government better. I ran on tariffs and making our country rich, and that's what's going to do. We're going to be doing something else that's going to be very, very good. We're going to be selling a gold card. You have a green card. This is a gold card. We're going to be putting a price on that card of about $5 million, and that's going to give you green card privileges plus. It's going to be a route to citizenship, and wealthy people will be coming into our country by buying this card. They'll be wealthy, and they'll be successful, and they'll be spending a lot of money and paying a lot of taxes and employing a lot of people. And we think it's going to be extremely successful. Never been done before, anything like this, but it's something that we're going to be putting out over the next, would you say 2 weeks out? Do you want to
2
say
weeks.
a couple of words about it?
Mr.
Sure.
President, are there
Wait a
any
minute.
requirements for that
Hang on
gold
a second.
card? Do you have to invest a certain amount of money in this country in order to qualify for that gold card?
Yeah, exactly.
So
Go
the
ahead.
EB-5 program was really, you lend some money, but it was full of nonsense, make-believe and fraud, and it was a way to get a green card that was low priced. So the president said, rather than having this sort of ridiculous EB-5 program, we're going to end the EB-5 program. We're going to replace it with the Trump Gold Card, which is really a green card gold. So they'll be able to pay $5 million to the U.S. government. They'll have to go through vetting, of course. We're going to make sure they're wonderful, world-class global citizens. They can come to America. The president can give them a green card, and they can invest in America, and we can use that money to reduce our deficit. Why do we give out lotteries of green cards? Why do we give out EB-5 for green cards? The President of the United States understands that the right answer is, why don't we eliminate the deficit of the United States of America instead?
The gold card, well, millions, but the gold card will bring in with it people that create jobs, very high level people. I think companies will pay to get people in. For instance, you today graduate from the Wharton School of Finance or Harvard or Stanford or any college, and nobody knows if you can even go to work for a company. So Apple and all these companies that want to get people to be working for them will be able to buy a card, and for the people that are number one in their class at top schools, I see that as one of the things. But generally speaking, it'll be people with money and people that create jobs, and they won't have to pay any tax on income outside of the United States, which they're not paying right now. They're not citizens, but they'll have to pay if they create jobs in the United States. They'll pay full taxes like everybody else. So you're getting big taxpayers, big job producers, and we'll be able to sell maybe 1 million of these cards, maybe more than that. And if you add up the numbers, they're pretty good. As an example, 1 million cards would be worth $5 trillion. $5 trillion.
Wow.
And if you sell 10 million of the cards, that's a total of $50 trillion. Well, we have 35 trillion in debt. That'd be nice. So we'll see. But it could be great. Maybe it will be fantastic. We have it all worked out from the legal standpoint. It's totally legal to do. Hasn't been done before. It's been done in many different forms. We give them away. Why should we give them away? We shouldn't give them away. And I think it's something very exciting. I think it's potentially just something that we're all very excited about. So it's a gold card. It's somewhat like a green card, but at a higher level of sophistication. It's a road to citizenship for people. And essentially people of wealth or people of great talent, where people of wealth pay for those people of talent to get in, meaning companies will pay for people to get in and to have long-term status in the country. And I think it's something we're very, very happy about. Would you have anything to say about that?
Well, many other countries, by the way, do this, including, of course, your 51st state does that.
And the money's earmarked for deficit reduction?
It may be earmarked for deficit, but it actually could be more money than that. I mean, if you did 10 million, you'd have $15 trillion left over. But generally, it's going to be pay down debt. Yes.
Do you need Congress for this? Do you think you need to
No, we
pass
don't
a
need
law?
Congress. No, because we're not doing citizenship. We're doing the card.
I see.
It's a path. It's a path to citizenship, a very strong path to citizenship. But we're not doing the citizenship. For that, I'd have to get Congress.
And would all countries be eligible for this gold card?
Depends. The countries largely, the people will be vetted very carefully.
Mr. President, on Ukraine, would you provide military support for Ukraine in the future under a peace agreement?
Say it again louder.
Would you provide military support for Ukraine in the future as part
You mean
of
like
a peace
security?
agreement?
Well,
Yeah.
people are going to do it. I think Europe will largely be responsible for that. European countries will be responsible.
But Macron asked for a U.S. backup.
Well, we'll see. I mean, right now, we're just in the process of negotiating. We've pretty much negotiated our deal on raw earth and various other things. We'll be looking at that security. You're talking about general security for Ukraine later on. I don't think that's going to be a problem. There are a lot of people that want to do it. And I spoke with Russia about it. They didn't seem to have a problem with it. So I think they understand. They're not going back in. Once we do this, they're not going back in.
So on that gold card, aircraft, would the U.S. provide, for instance, air defense?
Well, I just told you, right now, we're not providing anything. You know, it's about Europe, too. Europe put in 100 billion and we put in $350 billion. It's not a fair thing. You know, we would normally say, and I say it now anyway, but we want equalization. They should put up actually more money than us because they're right there. We have an ocean in between. But we've had very good talks with Russia. We've had very good talks with Ukraine, and we think it maybe will come to an end and we'll stop killing young people all over the battlefield and elsewhere.
On Europe, so do you plan to maintain heavy military presence in Europe in the long term, like tens of thousands of troops?
We'll be involved. Yeah, we'll be involved in Europe. We're involved in Europe now. Europe is our friend. They took advantage of us on trade. We don't like that, what the EU does. We don't like that, but we'll solve that the old-fashioned way. We'll give them the same reciprocal numbers. You know, we're talking about a reciprocal tax, you know that. And if they charge us, we charge them. Right now, they charge us much, much more than we charge them. And they have non-monetary taxes also and tariffs. And we're going to change that. It's all changing. It's all changing. We're not going to be the people that we were. We had people in this office sitting right at this desk or another model of this desk, because as you know, the other desk is right now being refurbished.
Is Steve Witkoff delaying his trip to the Middle East?
No, not that I know of. No, Steve. And the Middle East has been great. Saudi Arabia has treated us really well. They really have. I think Qatar has treated us very well too. They want to get that whole mess ended in the Middle East. You know, we don't even talk about that anymore. You guys haven't asked one question about the Middle East, but the Middle East seems to be doing relatively well.
May I ask about the Middle East, sir, about the Middle East? For months, even before you were elected in November, you've spoken about your desire to free all of those hostages that have been held by Hamas since October the 7th, a year and a half ago. And just a few weeks ago, you gave an ultimatum. You said if they're not all released by noon on February the 15th, there would be hell to pay. Is Hamas thumbing their nose at you, Mr. President?
No, I think the opposite. So, as you know, they weren't going to release any more hostages. And I said there's going to be hell to pay. And then they agreed that they were going to release the hostages that they had agreed to release, plus an extra one. And so that you could say that was a big difference. But I said it from that point, it's up to Bibi Netanyahu and Israel. I may have taken a different stance. But they did release, they went back to releasing the hostages. But if you remember, they said we weren't going to release any. They've totally ended it. And I said, well, they're not going to release any. They'll be held to pay. And but the rest is really up to him. What I may have done it differently than him. It's not my decision. It's his decision. But they did release all of those hostages. So.
Mr. President, when you spoke to Vladimir Putin, did he raise or did you discuss at all the possibility of a minerals deal on the Ukrainian land that Russia now controls?
I didn't discuss it. No. I'd like to buy minerals on Russian land too, if we can. The rare earth. They have very good rare earth also. They both do. I would say that. And oil and gas. Look, it's a great thing. If we sell this, it's great for Russia too, because we can do deals there. They have very valuable land that isn't utilized. So something like that could take place, yeah.
Have you got raising or lifting sanctions against Russia on the table? Is your
No, we haven't lifted any sanctions on
Is it
anybody.
on the table as part of any negotiation?
I guess it will be at some point, but right now we haven't agreed to lift sanctions on anybody.
On that gold card, getting back to that, I'm fascinated by this, Mr. President.
You should be
As
fascinated by
Secretary.
it. Your taxes will go down to nothing.
Would a Russian oligarch be eligible for a gold card?
Yeah, possibly. Hey, I know some Russian oligarchs that are very nice people. It's possible. They're not quite as wealthy as they used to be. They're not as wealthy as they used to be. I think they can afford. I think they can afford $5 million.
So they have
No, a lot of people are going to want
Yet they
to.
would be eligible.
A lot of people are going to want to be in this country, and they'll be able to work and provide jobs and build companies and pay taxes. All of those things. It's an incredible thing. I mean, this is the group that is the first to hear it. Nobody's heard about it. Nobody ever thought about it, but we've been thinking about it very, very strongly over the last week. And I was going to announce it sometime next week, and I figured, why not? We have a lot of cameras blazing right now. We might as well do it now. We'll have Caroline announce it the next time. No, it's a great thing. The gold card. Remember the words, the gold card. Somebody said, can we call it the Trump gold card? I said, if it helps, use the name Trump. I'll give it to you for free.
I like it. Mr. President, you probably just launched 10,000 stories. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more on what Russian oligarchs you know
I
or
know.
don't know?
Isn't it interesting how many stories we do tell? And they all turn out to be true, and they all turn out to be ultimately correct. Trump was right about everything. Do you have one of those Trump was right about everything hats? I'm going to give it to this gentleman. Get me one of them.
But they're all going to be vetted. Everybody who comes in gets vetted, okay? They get vetted, so you got to, we're going to begin in 2 weeks.
About 2 weeks. The sale will start in about 2 weeks.
Mr. President, do you see a more active role for Zelensky now, given the status?
I hope so. I mean, look, I think that we want to get that country back on its feet. And right now, it's been destroyed. And so here, give me this here. Give me all of them. Look. See that? Trump was right about everything. It just came in. Somebody sent, I said, this was sent in by a fan. I said, I think we should make some of them, right? But we were pretty much. You want one?
I'll pass.
Are you allowed to take one?
Probably
Because
not.
he'll consider it. I know him well. He's sort of a stiff. Yeah, Brian, you're not a stiff. He's sort of a stiff guy. He'll take other things, but not a free hand.
Always say yes to the president. Always say yes to the
Would
president.
anybody like one?
Mr. President, an easy question perhaps for you. Maybe it's difficult. I'm going to ask you this question about the
Who do you work for?
I work for 2 news organizations.
Who?
I work for 2 news organizations.
Yeah, who are they?
I work for Gray Television, America's second largest broadcaster, and I work for iHeartRadio. So there you go. But let me ask you the easier, tough question, Mr. President. The Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl. Are they being extended an invitation?
They will be. We haven't yet, but we will be. I thought it was a great performance by them. And absolutely, they'll be extended that invitation. Would you do that right away, by the way? We'll do it right away. We're going to do it sometime today. And they deserve to be down here, and we hope to see them. We have a lot of teams. We just had the great hockey team, as you know, Florida come here. We have many of the great athletes come that win things.
What's the main obstacle holding up this PGA Tour Live Golf?
Well, they have to get together. They've had a lot of discussion back and forth. They both are meaning well, and a deal will ultimately happen. I think it'll happen pretty quickly. It'd be nice to see the best golfers be able to play against each other.
What's your role been in this whole?
Just to help expedite it. Tiger was here. Adam Scott was here. Jay Monahan was here the other day. Just to really help expedite it. We had Yasser here from Saudi Arabia, great guy. These are all great people, and they want to work it out. So if I can help them work it out, I don't get anything out of it. If I can help them work it out. I just think golf, it's very much of an individual sport, and you want to see the best players playing against each other, not playing in 2 different locations, right?
What's going to be more challenging, a PGA Live deal or a Russia-Ukraine deal?
I think the PGA deal is much more complicated.
Sir, may I ask the Middle East question, if I may? What's your take on what's happening in the West Bank and what Israel?
Well, it's some movement up there that a lot of people are concerned about. And there's been a lot of Israeli movement. They're up there for a reason. All of a sudden, maybe they're not feeling so good about that. So that'd be terrible. I hope that doesn't happen. But there is movement up there that nobody knew about. Right? You know that, right?
Yeah, and when you say, are you concerned about it as well?
I'm concerned about everything. I want the world to be peaceful. You know, when I left here, we had no war. We had defeated ISIS in less than 4 weeks. In fact, I took the general that defeated ISIS and I put him in charge of the whole ball game because that's what we want. We want winners. Raisin Cane, you know, Raisin. When I heard that name, I said, I like that name. That's the kind of general I like. So we'll see. But he was great. He's a great soldier. Not a politician, a soldier, a real soldier. You know that, Brian. This guy was the real. This guy's the
story a million times.
Yeah, this guy's the real deal.
He is.
And I think he's going to do a great job. But think of it. We had no wars. We had no problems. We had no inflation. We had no problems. And then all of a sudden you have October 7th in Israel, which was horrible. And then you see what happened with Ukraine. Russia would have never gone in if the election weren't rigged. It was a rigged election. The 2020 election was rigged, and we got out of it. And you see what happened. You see what happened to our country. Inflation, Afghanistan, that horrible withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think when Russia saw what happened in Afghanistan, they said, wow, it's a paper tiger. We're not a paper tiger. We are the strongest military force in the world. And by the way, Pete Hegseth is doing a great job. But we didn't have wars. We didn't have inflation. We had a strong border. We had everything going good. And then Biden got in, and he's, my opinion, the worst president in the history of our country. I think Jimmy Carter was a very happy man when he passed away 2 weeks ago.
What are you expecting at the cabinet meeting tomorrow?
It's going to be a cabinet meeting, and I'll preside. Unlike Biden, I'll preside over my own cabinet meeting.
Mr. President, how would you compare your cabinet in your second term to your cabinet that you had in your first term?
Well, I had some great people my second term. I think this is deeper. I think it's better because it's deeper. I had some people that I didn't really like too much in my cabinet, but I didn't know Washington then. I was a New York person. I knew New York intimately, but I had to rely on people. I had great people. Look, we got the biggest tax cuts in history. I rebuilt the military. I mean, we did so much. We did unbelievable. Even right to try. Somebody was saying today they were saved by right to try. We did right to try medically. We did transparency medically. That was a big thing, but Biden canceled that one. He didn't cancel right to try, which is interesting. He didn't cancel Space Force. He was going to cancel Space Force. Space Force is turning out to be invaluable. Amazing. We created Space Force. But think of it. We rebuilt our entire military, and now we're going to have to patch it up a little bit again because of what's happened. No, this was a grossly incompetent administration. The only thing they were good at was cheating in elections and the weaponization of government. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys.
It's a bedtime to take.